What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and the latest controversy to sweep the 40K sphere is the decision by several German tournament organizers to house rule some of 10th edition's mechanics in lieu of an official FAQ. This has really taken the discussion channels of the community by storm, but in my opinion, it might be a little overblown. The event in question that has announced a series of house rules is the Münsterland GT, a 50-player event that looks like it's gonna break the 32-ish player cap. It's a reasonably sized event, but not particularly impressive in today's day and age of fairly common 200+ player majors. So what are the changes that the event has announced? The first is a revision to towering, using the 9th edition visibility rules for towering models when they interact with terrain, meaning that they are not automatically obscured by terrain. I did just publish a video earlier tonight on terrain and how that interacts with both towering and non-towering units. So if you want the comparison, go check it out over there. But basically this means that towering units would be able to be seen over or through ruined terrain even if they are not within it, but removes the portion of towering where a towering unit is able to see through terrain without penalty as long as they can draw a true line of sight. This created a lot of problems with towering units like Knights and Wraith Knights, especially given the fact that a lot of terrain for tournament organizers is still based on the 9th edition rule set, and they have terrain that is built assuming that units can defend them using the obscuring keyword that the towering mechanic now entirely ignores. Speaking of Wraith Knights, their D cannons were also going to be eroded to lose the devastating wounds ability. Indirect fire was also being reverted to the 9th edition mechanic, reducing the ballistic skill of the attacker and giving +1 to the save characteristic of the target. The Thousand Suns Twist of Fate Cabal ritual would be changed to reduce armor saving throws of the unit being targeted by -2 instead of entirely ignoring their armor save altogether. The range of fire Overwatch was reduced to 12 inches from the previous 24 as printed in the 10th edition book. Mortal wounds generated by a single unit were to be capped at 6 mortal wounds per unit per phase when targeted specifically at non-monsters or vehicles. Any additional wounds would be handled as normal wounds. And last but certainly not least, models can move over and stand on top of objective markers without limitations, basically reverting the uninteractable objective marker rule that the 10th edition core rules introduced. Allegedly, there is also a discussion being had by the tournament organizers about the lone operative and other untargetability style effects. I talked about these when I talked about the best Space Marine units and how we may be angling to a metagame where we see basically nothing but units with the lone operative style of defensive mechanic on them. Otherwise, infantry would be killed very quickly by indirect fire, and they may be trying to alleviate that a little bit. But I couldn't find anything on the event listing proper. This was just in discussions elsewhere. Now, these proposed changes come in lieu of any official FAQ, and the tournament organizers have been very upfront and open with the fact that if they do see a GW FAQ or changes to these mechanics, they will take that into account before the event begins. Now, as I've discussed on this channel previously, tournaments are in a really awkward place when it comes to these big edition shakeups. They basically have the choice between reverting to 9th edition and playing an outdated rule set that robs a lot of relevance from their event and has the potential for players to no-show and just go play events in a more updated metagame with rules that they're going to practice for use in the future. Or they play the game in a relatively broken state that leads to a skewed result and some hurt feelings from players who aren't on the bleeding side of the cutting edge. Or they could just bite the bullet and create their own house rules. Now, this event in particular is happening on July 1st, at the time of recording only about 10 days time. So the tournament organizers don't have the luxury of waiting for an FAQ to resolve any of these problems from Games Workshop's end, especially given the fact that they want to give their players time enough to respond to any FAQ changes that they may make with their list construction, practice, or other preparation for the event. They have to make a decision now, and they couldn't really wait for any additional news. Now, at the risk of editorializing a little bit, while I'm normally against house rules for competitive play, the 10th edition rollout is certainly considered to be an extenuating circumstance. And given the rocky start of 40K's edition launches in the past, I think that assuming some house ruling is in order to make a relatively balanced competitive format. So I think in this case, house rules are probably acceptable, and these changes are relatively light and incredibly reasonable. It's clear that the team behind them have tried to address the problems with specific mechanics without trying to rewrite them wholesale or straight up ban them or entire factions from their event. The changes to the core mechanics like towering, overwatch, and indirect fire are totally fair. Like I mentioned earlier, towering creates an enormous benefit for knights or other super heavy walkers. And while I think it's not unreasonable to make it so that they can also hide behind obscuring terrain, as conceptually weird as that sounds, I do think that the new survivability of these units means that them being able to be seen through ruins isn't the end of the world. But giving them the ability to basically have free reign over the tabletop, assuming that the terrain of the event isn't perfectly constructed to make the towering rule less powerful, just errata-ing it into something more reasonable totally makes sense. Overwatch being limited to 12 inches rather than 24 is totally fine, and honestly doesn't even significantly change the mechanic, given the fact that you're mostly overwatching with auto-hitting or powerful short-range weapons anyway. This basically removes the consequence where you get accidentally overwatched by indirect fire out of the middle of nowhere. And speaking of that indirect fire, I think the mechanics that we had for indirect fire in 9th edition were totally fine. I don't know if we needed the additional buffs that we got in 10th edition, especially given how many units in 10th edition can ignore the indirect fire penalty. Wraith Knight D-cannons are the strongest gun on that platform, but they don't pay for the privilege. Especially given the new rules surrounding war gear and how all war gear is costed equally, you also expect them to be of equal power level. But for the Wraith Knight specifically, that is not quite the case. The D-cannon is clearly the best weapon in the slot. And given the fact that Wraith Knights are incredibly inexpensive to begin with, I think that depowering their weapons to be around the same power level is totally reasonable. Thousand Sons Twist of Fate is still an incredibly powerful ability, modifying basically every unit in the Thousand Sons faction to a baseline of AP 3 and synergizing well with the army's already high volume of high AP weapons. Honestly, adding 2 AP to Thousand Sons units with the Twist of Fate is actually not much of a nerf, and in most situations it's actually going to play exactly the same. Your Forge Fiends are going to be the equivalent of AP 5, meaning that a 2+ save only then gets a save if it's in cover. Most of the time, units are protected by some sort of invulnerable save, which a base AP 3 weapon will largely bump up to either way. It basically means that a 3+ save unit without an invulnerable save doesn't get absolutely cooked by Thousand Sons immediately, but in most other situations, it's going to be essentially identical. This is a very light hand to an incredibly powerful ability. The proposed Mortal Wound FAQ is a little bit confusing in practice, and I think potentially hits units that are designed around dealing mortal wounds a little bit too hard. Units equipped with things like combi weapons that take a big hit when targeting monsters and vehicles for the additional mortal wound generation onto infantry units do feel like they're maybe unnecessarily underpowered by this, and especially with the interaction with devastating wounds, exactly how this is meant to work is a little bit confusing. The additional mortal wounds that are generated by a over 6 damage weapon converting a devastating wound counted, or do they have to be saved against independently, or are they just lost entirely? I'm not entirely sure what the intention is there, and it might be more trouble than it's worth. But that said, the change to move blocking objectives is one that I actually expect to be widely implemented in tournament play, especially since it's not even being respected in a lot of the games broadcast on Games Workshop's own channels, and I have a sneaking suspicion that it may make an appearance in something like a GT packet in the future. It just has the unintended consequence of additionally nerfing melee units and large monsters that are specifically trying to get into melee, which are unit archetypes that are already not that good in 10th edition 40k, and just makes them feel really bad for kind of no reason. It's a super feels bad mechanic for sure, and I would be glad to see it removed. Now, on the overall spectrum of house rules, these are extremely light. I don't think that they're gonna dramatically warp the metagame of this tournament or invalidate any prospective attendees' army. And it seems like an overall conscientious decision from the TO team that's pressed for time with their event coming up very shortly. My hope is that Games Workshop addresses a lot of these issues with their own FAQ, but again, this is a team that can't wait. So I don't think it's widely controversial for them to make a decision like this, with the intention of improving their event, but without the time to wait for an official change to take place. But let me know down in the comment section what you think about it, and thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great. I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.